Hi, I'm going to do an overview of the language services and accessibility that we have here at Cheshire Medical Center. My name is Dawn Walshman. I'm the Interpreter Program ADA 504 Coordinator here at Cheshire. So I oversee language services as well as accessibility. And when we talk about language services, we mean interpreter services or any other services that may warrant effective communication during a healthcare encounter. Oftentimes, I co-facilitate this piece with Ruth Abbott. She is not with us today, but I do want to mention Ruth. She is a wonderful resource here at Cheshire. She's our family resource counselor. She's also an application counselor, and she's certified in the health insurance marketplace as a New Hampshire Medicaid specialist. She's a great resource should you encounter someone who's in need of coverage, healthcare coverage. Ruth may be a great point of contact to be able to assist folks with getting those kinds of services. So what is it that I would like you to take away from this particular training? I'd like you to be able to identify the importance of having language services and or auxiliary aids that are readily available. And we'll talk a little bit about what language services and auxiliary aids are. Explain the importance of having the patient or the recipient of services identify what it is that they need for meaningful access to their healthcare. And then, most importantly, for you to be able to identify the resources that are available. The reality is, you're going to go through this training today. You may not come up against this for a period of time, and I want you to be able to remember where your resources are. So ultimately here at Cheshire Medical Center, one of our primary goals is ensuring that communication is effective, particularly during clinical encounters, but really in any kind of encounter we will have here at Cheshire. We feel it's important for you as well as for those that you're communicating with. Our ultimate goal is equity. We want to make sure this is a huge piece of equity in healthcare. And so we want to make sure we're communicating effectively. Oftentimes when we think about these things, people think about making sure that everyone is equal. And I challenge you to think about not just equality, but really equity. And if you look at the picture here on the screen, this is a great example of what we might mean. When we think about equality, we think about everybody having the same thing or everybody having equal access. And from this picture, as a great example, a fence, being able to see over a fence to see a soccer game. If somebody's really tall, and well, let's just say if we give everybody the same box, you can see here for someone who's really tall who could see over the fence already, the box just allowed them to see over the fence even more. For someone who's average size or medium size, they received the box and maybe they were able to see over the fence a little bit better, maybe not. For somebody who's shorter, who is having difficulty seeing over the fence, we give them the same size box as the other two individuals, and they still can't see over the fence, even though they've all received something that's equal. Our goal really is equality, which is the next picture. It's really about providing what it is that is going to allow somebody to have effective access. And so here we can see somebody who's taller who could already see over the fence. Well, maybe they didn't need anything at all. For somebody who's medium size, maybe they needed a little something extra to see over the fence. And then for that person who couldn't see over the fence to begin with, they're given a box that's a bit larger. And now, yay, they're able to see over the fence and see the soccer game. So that's ultimately our goal when we think about language services and accessibility. I'm going to start with showing a video. Full disclosure, the video is a bit dated. It's from 2009. I haven't opted to switch the video, even though some of the terminology in it may not be what's considered politically correct today. But I do like to show this video because it is all adults who identify as having disabilities or differing abilities who are talking about their experience in the healthcare in healthcare. And I think it's a really important message. I will stop the video a little bit early. It starts to move into some of the social
People
barriers to healthcare. And that's really not what I want to focus on. I want our focus really to be on the stories.
with disabilities at times encounter barriers when trying to access medical care. Common obstacles are physical barriers, communication barriers, attitudinal barriers, and social policy barriers.
Just getting on an exam table for a public exam is very difficult. It takes a lot of time and a lot of energy for me. So there's some things that I admit that I put off or, just kind of avoid.
Ramps, elevators, adjustable exam tables, and other equipment enable access to medical care, as well as to optometry, dental care, and a full range of health services.
To my speech impairment, they don't always realize that I am able to speak for myself. So if I happen to have someone with me for some reason, they tend to talk to that person rather than to me.
So there's an easy tendency for people to say, oh, you're deaf and I don't need to communicate with you. Sort of a mentality from the old days that exists even still today, that some hearing people think that deaf people are mutes and even dumb. But we have to remove that stigma.
There are often generalizations that if you can't see, then you also can't make a decision, or even sometimes you can't talk. I've actually had people raise their voice when they were communicating with me. It's like, I can hear okay, I just can't see.
One of the greatest barriers is still the social kind of misconceptions about me and my lifestyle. Me and my health, really, I think. They don't realize I have a very active, full life, or they have a lot of other interests, and my health isn't my main preoccupation.
Doctors think that I am mentally retarded and speak to me as if I am mentally retarded. And I usually have to tell them that I have a master's degree.
Okay, I am going to stop the video. This is where it gets into the social policy barriers. And really, that's not going to be our focus. What I'd like you to focus on is some of the stories that we just heard and some of the barriers that people face, whether it's physical or attitudinal, or in regards to communication. And again, I want to focus on equity. And so when we listen to these stories, they all stand out in their own ways. But ones that are very clear to me as I think about Darlene. Darlene was the woman who speaks differently than most people speak, and she walks differently than most people speak. And she talks about the assumptions that are made about her, about because she speaks and walks differently, that maybe she can't make a decision, or they'll talk to someone else if she has them with her rather than speaking directly to her, or the assumptions that are made about her cognitive abilities because of the way she speaks and moves. And she actually has a master's degree. She's a smart woman. She's quite independent, and she does things on her own. I also think about Laura, who was the woman who was deaf. Often people, who is blind. Often people are surprised when they learn that she's blind, because there's often these assumptions we have that blind folks wear dark sunglasses, or I have to see a cane, or things like that. And she mentions how people, when they're talking to her, when she lets them know that she is blind or that she can't see, they raise their voice. Or the assumptions around somebody who uses American Sign Language, or because they're deaf, and what their cognitive abilities are. And it wasn't mentioned in the video, but often there's an assumption that English is the first language of someone who is deaf, when in fact it's not. It's American Sign Language, which is very different from English. And then I also think about some of the physical barriers that we have in healthcare, things like adjustable exam tables and ramps. And so when I listen to these stories, I would like to challenge you to make sure that we avoid the things that were talked about in these stories and think about what are some of the ways that we can provide equity to these individuals should they be visiting Cheshire Medical Center. And what I would encourage you to do is to really ask the person and think about how is it that you would be comfortable asking those kinds of questions. We'll talk a little bit about how to ask as we move further into the training. But often people are not doing these things because they're coming from a place of ill intent or because they're mean, although it can happen sometimes. But I think the majority of time that's not the intent. The intent often is because someone is uncomfortable and they're not sure what to do, or they're acting on previous experiences. So I would challenge you to think about how do we treat each person that we encounter here as an individual and ask the appropriate questions to make sure that we can provide equity in someone's healthcare. Next, what I'd like to do is I'm going to show another video. I would like you to imagine that you are on a tropical island in Brazil. You're on this wonderful vacation. You're not sitting here watching this video. And you're on that vacation. You are someone who is a diabetic. Generally, your diabetes is controlled. You go on an all-day excursion out in Brazil. You get back to the hotel, and next thing you know, you black out and you wake up and you're in the hospital in Brazil. You've been in the hospital for several hours. And now you're at a point where you are getting ready for discharge, and your nurse is going to be walking you out as you're being discharged. During this discharge, your nurse is letting you know what happened and what the treatment and follow-up is going to be from here. Okay, I'm going to stop the video there. So what did your nurse tell you? What happened? And what's the treatment? And what is your follow-up going to be? Maybe right now you're thinking, well, I have no idea. I don't understand a word that my nurse just spoke to me. And so I play this video. So first of all, I may ask what language was that? And there's lots of guesses. That is actually Spanish backwards. It is in fact somebody talking about diabetes and A1C results, but they're doing it in Spanish and then it was recorded backwards. And I do that purposely. My goal is so that you're not fully understanding what the nurse is saying. And the purpose of that is, again, to really put yourself in the shoes of somebody who chooses to read, write, or discuss their healthcare in a language other than English, and to really think about this is what English might sound like to them. I also really caution any assumptions around if someone spoke enough English or uses enough English to be able to make an appointment or to let you know their name and address. I really want to remind folks that the things that we talk about in a medical setting are often not everyday jargon. They're words that are very complex, very important, and they're things that we want to make sure that people are able to fully understand and follow. In addition to that, we want to make sure that our staff are fully understanding the communication as well. It's extremely important, especially for our clinical personnel, to be able to have a full understanding of what's happening and identify treatment and follow-up plans. Maybe you're thinking, I didn't understand the nurse, but that's okay. They're going to give me some discharge instructions and I'll be able to read those when I get back to the hotel. When you receive your discharge instructions, it's the words that are written on the screen under what did I say? And if you know some Vietnamese or some Spanish or some Gujarati, you may be able to read those, maybe not all of those. Those are the three languages you see. The top one is Vietnamese, the middle is Spanish, and the bottom is Gujarati. They all do say, what did I say? But again, understanding that there are many people who may choose not to discuss, read, or write about their healthcare in English. And when we are giving them information in English, it may actually look like this or sound like this. So again, challenging you to think about equity. providing what it is that somebody may need to have equitable access when they're here at Cheshire Medical Center, and how is it that you get there, and how do you ask? So why is it important that you know this? Why do we want to make sure that you know this? Well, here at Cheshire Medical Center, we really value our patient as well as our staff experience. If we have staff and visitors or patients or family members who are not engaged in effective communication and fully can't understand what's happening in an encounter, it really does not bode well for a good experience. And not only that, it could hinge on safety and quality of care. We really don't want that to happen. It's also required by law. So the ability to offer interpreter services as well as auxiliary aids, and I will get into what those are in the next slide, they are requirements by federal law for places of public accommodation who receive federal funding. Cheshire Medical Center is a place of public accommodation. We do in fact receive federal funding, so we are bound to follow some federal laws. These particular things are covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as well as Section 1557 of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. Some folks know that as Obamacare, but that they are particularly covered under those, as well as a few others. Section 504 is another that may come to mind, but these are the primary ones. So we want to make sure we're following the law. If we don't, it's a liability. And Cheshire Medical Center has experienced that. We went under legal action in 2005 and again in 2011. Both times it was we were violating the Americans with Disabilities Act in not providing sign language interpreters upon request and when there was a need identified for such services. It was very difficult, particularly the 2011 case. And we were in fact in violation, and we were not providing the best care to these particular individuals. And again, it goes back up to patient and staff experience, and ultimately it's the right thing to do. We want to ensure that we are providing equity and that everybody has effective communication while they are here at Cheshire. So what is it that you need to know under the law? Well, first and foremost, any interpreter services that are provided here at Cheshire Medical Center, as well as any kind of auxiliary aids that we are providing that's within a reasonable request, we are required to provide those free of charge to our patients, their family members, or the recipient of services, or any visitor. So it's at no cost to them. It's actually illegal to pass that cost on to the patient or their family member, as well as onto any kind of insurance. So it's a cost of doing business. And I often relate it to, when I think about the Americans with Disabilities Act, there are physical things that they require, things like ramps or things like handicapped bathroom facilities or handicapped parking spaces. We don't charge individuals each and every time they use those. It's a cost of our overhead business. And so this falls under that same realm. We're also required by law to be providing qualified interpreters, and the law goes so far as to define what is a qualified interpreter, and it's somebody who can interpret effectively, accurately, and impartially, both receptively and expressively, using any necessary specialized vocabulary, which leads me into the next bullet. Friends and family members really may not act as interpreters unless it's specifically requested by a patient. And we have a process. We actually have a legal document, which we call a waiver, that someone would sign when they are legally waiving their right to effective communication or interpreter services. I do want to mention that even though it is the right of the patient or the recipient of services, I often remind our clinical personnel in particular that you have just as much right under the law to use an interpreter or an auxiliary aid for you. And ultimately you are liable, and the hospital is liable. So It's important to note that interpreters are not only for the patients or not only for their family members or the visitor. An interpreter or an auxiliary aid is used for everyone in the encounter. You don't share a language, or you may have information that's important for someone to see or to hear or to have the ability to let you know something. So we are liable. So I strongly encourage you to utilize qualified interpreting. When I do also want to mention, which is in one of the notes down at the bottom, that all of these services are in fact HIPAA protected by HIPAA and HIPAA compliant. So here at Cheshire Medical Center, we contract with certified interpreters. In the state of New Hampshire, sign language interpreters are required to be certified as well as licensed. And then for our spoken language interpreters, we contract with the Language Bank, who also certifies their interpreters. And within those contracts, and for interpreters, certified and qualified interpreters, they are bound by a code of professional conduct. And then our contracts do cover confidentiality and HIPAA as well. And it's important to let patients know that, as well as the fact that it is at no cost to them. We want to remember that friends and family members are often not impartial. When I think about our 2011 case, I think about the fact that a family member was utilized to act as an interpreter in that particular situation. And though it was not clear communication, the other piece was the patient was given a diagnosis that would not have been shared with the family member. So we really need to make sure that we are not using friends or family members or unqualified interpreters. Qualified interpreters are not going to be partial. They are going to be neutral in the situation. They're going to ensure that all the communication is flowing back and forth. They also are going to have the ability to interpret effectively and accurately. So everything that is said by you will be interpreted, and everything said by the person you're communicating with will be interpreted. Friends and family members often are not able, they're not trained to be able to do that. In addition, I worry about knowing some vocabulary. Qualified interpreters, they do have to have some form of medical training when they are interpreting in the medical setting, and they're familiar with how to interpret specific vocabulary. So for example, I'm a sign language interpreter by trade. We often talk about pulmonary embolisms. In sign language, there is no specific sign for a pulmonary embolism. There's a lot that goes into it. It's a very visual language. So as a sign language interpreter, I may need to get some clarification from the person who's speaking about pulmonary embolisms. I interpret about the concept of a pulmonary embolism. And at the end of the interpretation, I then assign it that English word. For somebody who's not a qualified interpreter, they might just fingerspell that term to someone who's deaf, and it would not be fully understood. So I really encourage, and we encourage here at Cheshire, to be using qualified interpreters. It's against the law to use anyone under the age of 18, so at no time should anyone under the age of 18 be asked to interpret or facilitate communication. We should be using qualified interpreters. And then under the law, auxiliary aids, they should be readily available and they must be provided within 15 minutes of a request. So what are auxiliary aids? Auxiliary aids simply are some tools that could provide some equity for someone in their healthcare, particularly around effective communication. So for example, when I think of folks who have hearing loss, one of the things that we can provide is a personal amplified listening device, or here at Cheshire, we often call them pocket talkers, and they look like this. I'm going to age myself, but it almost looks like a Sony Walkman from the 80s. Other things that we could provide is documentation in large font for people who have difficulty seeing or who have low vision. We can translate into Braille should somebody be blind and use Braille to be able to read documents. We translate English information into other languages like Spanish and Vietnamese and Gujarati should someone not be able to read information in English. Something as simple as a pen and paper or a whiteboard with a marker is also considered an auxiliary aid. So ultimately, they are tools that provide provide effective access to communication during encounters. Here at Cheshire, we do have what we call ADA toolboxes located on every floor in both our ambulatory and inpatient settings, as well as in all of our satellite offices. And I will show you a resource how you can find your closest ADA box. But we have things in there like whiteboards and personal amplified listening device, magnifiers for people who may need to be able to see information magnified. So those are just a few of the things. And then the other things that I mentioned already are in the notes. We're a place of public accommodation, so this is the cost of doing business. And it's important to also note that individuals are not required by law to request service each and every time. So if they are a regular patient of ours and it's been noted that there is an auxiliary aid need or an interpretation need, we should be noting that and documenting that and providing it each and every time, regardless of requests. And so when it is identified, we do make a notation in the medical record. That's done in the demographic section, as well as there's often a permanent comment put in the medical record so that folks are aware. So maybe you're thinking, well, somebody's in front of me and I'm not sure how to ask. We really discourage asking or saying, do you need an interpreter? As I mentioned, an interpreter is for everyone in an encounter. So these are some things that we've scripted that could be very helpful for you. I really recommend saying to someone, what language do you use to read, write, and discuss your healthcare? And let them tell us. Once we know if they say Spanish, then we know if they're coming for an encounter, we're going to provide a Spanish interpreter. And if they read and write about their healthcare in Spanish, then it may require translation services as well, and we would provide those. In regards to an auxiliary aid, if we see somebody or there's an identification, we could say something like, auxiliary aids and services are available free of charge. Would you like to borrow? And we could say a pocket talker or personal amplified listening device. Would you like us to provide documentation and lodge fund? Is there, or if you're unsure, you could say, we have auxiliary aids and services that are free of charge. Is there anything that would be helpful for you that we could provide? And just check in with the person. Let them self-identify what it is that's going to work for them to ensure equity. So what are your resources? Well, now that you're here at Cheshire Medical Center, you will have access to our internal intranet site. Once you go on our intranet site, when you open the main page, at the top of our intranet site, you're going to see this bar here. You'll see the picture of Dr. Caruso, our president and CEO. If you scroll all the way over, you're going to see something called patient-centered communication. Often people refer to it as the area with the blue ear, which is here. Once you click on that, it will open this here, and you're going to see some different tabs. There's a tab for deaf and hard of hearing, a tab for blind or low vision, a tab for limited English proficiency or LEP. There's a tab for culture and diversity, handoff communications, as well as service animals. So let's say that you're faced with somebody who is requesting a Spanish interpreter, or that you've identified would need a Spanish interpreter available for the appointment or the encounter. You could go to the limited English proficiency section, open that up, and in there, there's a flow chart that will bring you through the process. We do provide interpreter services 24/7, 365. We do it in 3 different ways. We do have on-site interpreters that are available. We more often than not use on-site interpretation for sign language as well as Spanish. However, we do work to get on-site interpreters here for other languages as well. We also have video remote interpretation that's available via iPads. They are on green stands that are located throughout our facility, at least on every floor in our ambulatory and inpatient units. And then we're also able to provide interpreter services via telephone. It's simply by dialing extension 3333 here on campus, or for one of our or in our satellites for one of our network phones, and a spoken language interpreter can be provided telephonically. As I mentioned, we have ADA kits with auxiliary aids that are readily available, located throughout our facility, all our satellites, and on every floor in the ambulatory and inpatient units. This is the resource that you would use to be able to find those. I know this was a brief overview. If you have any questions, I encourage you please to reach out to me. That's what I'm here for. My email is located on the intranet site, but I'm at dwelshman@cheshire-med.com, or you can contact me via phone at extension 6656 or via Vocera by dialing extension 6890 and saying interpreter. If you have any questions, please send them my way. I'm happy to respond. I want to thank you very much for your time. Welcome aboard, and we are very happy to have you. Have a great day.